morning, everyone. Thank you to the Marion Institute and to all of you for having me here today. I'm so happy to be here with you all at this gathering about connecting us all for change. Again, my name is Diana Duarte, and I am the Communications Director of MADRE. MADRE is an international women's human rights organization, and we partner with grassroots women worldwide, from Latin America to the Middle East to Africa, to do two things. One, to confront the immediate threats and to improve conditions in the communities of our partner organizations, and two, to advocate for their human rights. When these two combine, when they connect for change, that's how we create lasting social justice. You've come here today to learn about innovators who are coming together to create positive change in their communities. And I'm here to tell you about how grassroots women worldwide are organizing to confront one of the biggest crises that we all face, and that's climate change. But first, I want to tell you a personal story. In 1956, my grandmother was a young woman with 4 small children living in the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of West Africa. On that arid chain of islands, there was never enough rain. What there was droughts powerful enough to be memorialized in traditional songs about fome, or hunger. These periods of drought and hunger defined life for decades, so people began to seek out new lives elsewhere, and my grandmother was one of them. She packed up 2 suitcases, got on a transatlantic boat, and came right here to New Bedford. Over the years, she worked hard to raise money to bring her children here to join her, and one of those children was my father. Driven by climate pressures and resource scarcity, hundreds of thousands of Cape Verdeans left the islands that they knew behind. Today, there are more Cape Verdeans living outside than inside of the islands, and many of them settled right here in New Bedford. But why am I telling you all of this? It's because this story does not stand alone. It's all connected. As climate change intensifies, it makes the Cape Verdean story almost prophetic. More and more places worldwide are being hit by droughts and famines, hurricanes and storms that turn the most vulnerable people into climate refugees. More and more people are being forced to adapt to their new, harsh circumstances or to leave their homelands altogether. And I'm telling you this because across the world and across history, women, just like my grandmother, have struggled to sustain themselves and their families in the face of a changing and often hostile climate. And this is a big part of why today's message, Connecting for Change, is so important. We're all connected by the ways our climate and our histories intersect. And our best chance for confronting our climate crisis head-on lies in recognizing these connections, and soon. Because the world has already reached a tipping point in its ability to absorb the harmful impacts of rampant resource exploitation. Years of industrialization and essentially unchecked greenhouse gas emissions have already begun to release a cascade of dangers. More severe storms, longer and drier droughts, more fatal flooding, coastlines erased by rising water levels. For many of you sitting in this room, these predictions are nothing new. But if we want to guard against these outcomes, we need action now. We need binding policy commitments by the world's governments to reduce and halt greenhouse gas emissions. This means changing the way we produce and consume our fuel, our food, our basic materials of life. We need to find ways to live more sustainably in our local communities and worldwide. And I'm saying this to convey to you all that we're living in an incredibly urgent moment. And to create the strong strategies that we need, we must remember the ways in which everything is connected, person to person, issue to issue, crisis to crisis. We can't afford to face the consequences of missing or ignoring those connections. So let's switch gears for a quick moment. Once I was at a United Nations conference on climate policy, and when I told another participant that I was there with a women's rights organization, he asked me, "So why exactly are you here? What's the connection between women and the climate crisis?" And I think it's important to take the time to answer that question. First of all, climate change is not gender neutral. Women and men have distinct social roles that women's rights activists have often sought to highlight and challenge. But these differing roles as they exist today mean that women and men are impacted differently by climate change. In nearly every society worldwide, women are responsible for securing food, water, and particularly in the global south, household fuel and medicinal plants. And these resources depend on the stability of the climate. This places women at the heart of the economy and the environment the world over. And in short, women's livelihoods depend more on the ecosystems that are threatened by climate change. It's becoming widely recognized that poor people are being hit the first and worst by the impacts of climate change. Fewer people, however, acknowledge that the majority of the poor people worldwide, nearly 6 in 10, are women. Fewer people also acknowledge the ways in which poverty and gender discrimination interact with climate change to produce deadly results for women and girls. Consider, for instance, that unequal access to resources within communities or even within families or households take away the economic safety net that women need during and after a disaster. Consider also that studies have found that natural disasters kill 3 to 4 times as many women as men. That's 3 to 4 times. Sometimes it's because when the floodwaters are rising, women are more likely to be at home caring for children and the elderly. They're not able to flee at a moment's notice. Sometimes it's because women are denied education and access to information, which may put early warning systems out of their reach. But women are not just victims of climate dangers, they're powerful sources of solutions. Women have historically developed the kinds of sustainable and local solutions to ecological challenges that we now need to adapt and replicate to confront climate change. These solutions include sustainable agriculture, preserving biodiversity, securing fresh water supplies, and more. Women have constructed wind-resistant housing in Bangladesh. Women have unionized to pool their knowledge as subsistence farmers in Sudan. Women worldwide are also spearheading strategies to confront the causes of climate change. In communities across the globe, women have made themselves a first line of defense in resource-rich territories. And here's an example of that. Nowadays, tree hugger is practically often used as an insult. But before and since that happened, women in India were active in preserving their country's tree cover by hugging trees. They were central to the Chipko movement, mobilizing in masses to encircle trees to keep them from being cut down by loggers. Remember that when we lose our trees, we destroy a vital mechanism to filter carbon out of the air and store it safely in our soil. When we face a large-scale problem like climate change, it's easy to assume that it demands a large-scale solution, and we do, in fact, need a coherent global response to this crisis. But sustainable practices in agriculture, industry, energy, community design, and even government, those occur in specific places. Just 2 weeks ago, I returned from a trip to Nicaragua. For more than 30 years, my organization, MADRE, has partnered with indigenous women there to confront the most pressing challenges that they face, to build peace and end violence, to bring vitally needed health services to their communities, to promote women's economic independence. Our ties to indigenous communities, in particular on the North Atlantic coast of that country, are deep and long-lasting. And I was there for a special occasion, an annual forum that's organized by a local organization, our partner organization, an indigenous women's group called Huanquitangni. This forum brought more than 1,000 women to a small town called Huaspam on Nicaragua's northern border, and many of those women had traveled for days to get there, some by foot, some on boats along a river. I met one woman who had traveled for 2 days in a canoe with her 1-month-old daughter strapped to her chest, just so that she could be part of the forum. So why did so many women feel that it was so important for them to be there? We asked that question to some of them. Many of them are leaders in their own villages, organizing to improve the conditions of families and communities there. They wanted to meet with other women activists from the region to share their stories and experiences. And they wanted to present their demands to the local and regional authorities who would be taking part in that forum. This annual forum represented a unique opportunity to strategize together and to collaborate, not unlike our gathering today. But over and over, we heard a refrain: climate change is a clear and present threat to their lives and communities. They see it in the irregular weather patterns that make local harvests unpredictable and threaten their water supply or their food supply. They see it in the intensified storms that have hit the North Atlantic coast of Nicaragua. These storms have washed harvests away, making their food security even more precarious. And just this past week, there have been torrential rains in Nicaragua that have displaced 33,000 people. At the forum, the women spoke out about the solutions that they have devised. For instance, with MADRE's support, our partners there have set up a seed bank. From one harvest to the next, they collect and preserve the seeds. This conserves local biodiversity and protects seed stores from worsening hurricanes associated with climate change. And in this way, Indigenous women at the grassroots level model the potential of a small-scale intervention with outsized impact. The impact lies not just in preserving women's livelihoods, local food security, and promoting alternatives to industrialized agriculture. It also models the kind of climate change response we need, one that is community-controlled and democratic. In other words, their seed bank means some measure of food security into the next planting season, but it also gives us a glimpse at what is possible, what it looks like when people control their food supply, what it looks like when women become community leaders and stage interventions to protect local well-being. If we don't recognize the leadership of Indigenous women like MADRE's partners at the local and global levels, that is a missed connection, the type of missed connection that we cannot afford as the clock runs down on our opportunities to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. Consider another story from MADRE's work with women worldwide. In Kenya, a long and terrible drought seized an area of rural and indigenous communities. Their water dried up. Their cattle, their primary source of income and financial security, those cattle died. Families did what they thought they had to do in order to survive. They turned to the one expendable resource they had left, their daughters. If they had daughters in school, they pulled them out. They thought it's better to have them at home searching for and hauling the dwindling water supplies. They thought, how can we worry about a thing like education when we're not even sure if we have enough food and water to survive? And some families found another option. Maybe there was an older man in the community who was richer by comparison. If he was willing to pay a dowry in exchange for marriage to their young daughter, that could mean the resources that they needed to survive. So they marry off their young daughter. Often that means no more schooling for her. At MADRE, we learned of these stories because we partner with a local women's organization there called the Indigenous Information Network. They run a network of girls' schools. They saw all the obstacles that get in the way of a girl going to school, and they saw the clear connection to climate change as plain as day. Climate change creates drought. Drought makes poor families take their girls out of school and marry them off too early. But when we talk about climate change in the media or in global policy, how often do we talk about these impacts, about what it means for women and girls like our partners in Kenya? This is another missed connection. When we recognize this type of connection, we're better able to respond to climate threats in ways that protect everybody, including the most vulnerable. And so far, the stories I've told have been small-scale and local, about what happens when women in India, in Bangladesh, in Sudan, in Nicaragua, and in Kenya act at the grassroots level. But it can't stop there. We need to have grassroots women's voices at the table with policymakers on climate. We need to make sure that environmental policies are informed by perspectives on how gender and climate change are related. And this is critical for 3 reasons. First, as I've said, the impacts of climate change are gender specific. Climate change policies that recognize this are better able to protect the majority of the world's people, including the most vulnerable, infants, children, the sick, the disabled, the elderly, who are often under the direct care of women. Second, if we ignore climate change, gender in climate change policies, we not only miss the chance to protect the most vulnerable, but we put them in even greater danger. Think about those early warning mechanisms that I mentioned that only operate in public spaces where women are denied access. And finally, third, without a gender analysis, climate change policies miss a critical opportunity that is embedded in the very threat that we face. And namely, that is that our global response to the climate crisis is our chance to reimagine our economies and our societies. This is arguably the only hopeful aspect of this crisis. But seizing this opportunity requires action that is visionary, holistic, equitable, and bold. To do this, environmental activists and other stakeholders need to consult with grassroots women as experts and not just as victims. And they must also support women's demands for an end to the multiple forms of discrimination that prevent women from becoming leaders. And this is a crucial part of MADRE's work. For decades now, we've worked with an understanding of the ways that local conditions are impacted by decisions made far away, often by policymakers with little knowledge of the people or places that they will affect. And no issue better illustrates this dynamic than climate change. While impacts such as floods and food shortages are local, their causes transcend national boundaries. And without a global policy response, the advances of place-based activists in one location are always at risk of being undermined by ongoing carbon pollution elsewhere. Climate change calls on us to empower local activists to have a voice in global policymaking. So at MADRE, we do this first by listening to grassroots women who are on the front lines of climate change, yet whose perspectives and priorities are largely absent from policymaking. We provide humanitarian aid and direct services, ensuring that local women can meet immediate needs for themselves and their families so that they can focus on longer-term goals, such as environmental sustainability. We provide training so that those activists are ready to represent their issues to policymakers. And we create the space for conversations not just between community-based activists and policymakers, but between the women themselves. By linking grassroots women around the world to one another, they are able to share strategies and learn from one another. And finally, we ensure that advances at the international level are brought home, so to speak, by the activists who help to realize them. We must ensure that activists can win implementation of promising policies and actually improve conditions on the ground. And this integrated strategy connects grassroots women to policymakers and to each other to create impactful change. I've been reading a book lately by a writer named Rebecca Solnit, and it's called Hope in the Dark. And it begins with a quote by Virginia Woolf that goes, "The future is dark," which on the whole is the best thing the future can be, I think. Thinking about climate change, it's easy to get overwhelmed and scared. We see that the future is dark, and we worry about what terrible thing might be around the corner. But the future is dark also because we don't know what comes next, and we have the power to shape it. In her book, Rebecca Solnit makes the case for hope. I want to share some of her inspirational words with you, and I quote, "I say all this to you because hope is not like a lottery ticket that you can sit on the sofa and clutch feeling lucky. I say this because hope is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency, because hope should shove you out the door, because it will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war, from the annihilation of the Earth's treasures, and the grinding down of the poor and marginal. Hope just means another world might be possible, not promised, not guaranteed. Hope calls for action. Action is impossible without hope." There is hope at the heart of everything I've been saying to you here today. When women organize to protect their communities from the worst of climate change, it's because of their abiding, irrepressible hope in the possibilities of the future. And before I finish here, I have one more personal note. My father, as I said, was one of the children that my grandmother worked to bring over here, and his name is Virgulina Duarte, and today is his 70th birthday. Happy birthday, Dad. It's a big milestone. He's seen many changes in his 70 years. And for instance, 70 years ago, we did not yet fully know what a crisis that climate change would become, but now we do. And I can't know what the world is going to look like when I'm 70, but my father has always taught me the importance of grappling with the world as it exists today to try to make it better for each other and for the next generation. And that value brought me to my work at MADRE, it's brought me here today, and I hope it will continue to connect us all for change. Thank you.